She married a man she thought was weak, until the war revealed the truth. The first thing Laura noticed about the alien delegation was that they were not afraid of anything. They stood in the center of the United Nations chamber, with their chests open, their six pale eyes scanning the room the way a buyer scans a property before purchase. Not hostile, not cautious, just measuring. The Varric were 8 feet tall. Their bodies were covered in interlocking plates of natural gray armor, smooth and fused, growing directly from their skin like a second skeleton worn on the outside. They had 4 arms, the lower 2 shorter and more precise, used for detailed work, the upper 2 wide and heavy, built for leverage. Their heads were angular and low, set close to the shoulder blades, and their eyes were distributed in a half-ring around the skull, so that nothing behind them was ever truly behind them. They had arrived 3 weeks ago. In those 3 weeks, they had taken New Carthage Colony, the Proxima Research Station, and a resource extraction platform orbiting Kepler 186. They had issued no demands during that time. They had simply taken things, methodically and without apparent emotion, like someone doing chores. Laura Holt sat in the second row of the press gallery, with her recorder running and her hands very still in her lap. She had covered wars before. She had stood in rubble and interviewed survivors and filed stories from field hospitals, and once spent 11 hours under fire in a collapsed building, in a city she was not permitted to name. She knew what fear looked like up close. She knew how it moved through a crowd. This was something different. This was not panic. This was the particular silence of an audience that had just realized the performance was real. The lead Varric, a creature whose designation translated roughly as Commander of Expansion Soon Reth, stepped forward from the group. Its lower hands were folded at its midsection. Its upper hands hung loose at its sides. The translator device mounted at its collar joint clicked twice before the words came out, flat and steady, carrying no tone at all. You have 72 hours to surrender full administrative access to your outer star systems. This includes all inhabited and uninhabited installations within the boundary coordinates you have been provided. Varric management of these zones will begin immediately upon your formal transfer of control. If you choose not to comply, we will begin relocating your populations from the contested zones. We do not wish to cause harm. Harm is simply the outcome of resistance. It is a logistical outcome, not an emotional one. No one in the chamber spoke. Laura kept her recorder steady. Around her she could hear the very faint sound of people not breathing, which is a specific sound, different from silence, the held tension of 100 lungs waiting. She looked down the row. Daniel was sitting 3 seats to her left. He was not press. He did not have a press credential or a diplomatic pass, or any affiliation she could identify with any organization that would grant him access to this room. Daniel had a way of getting into rooms he was not supposed to be in. Not aggressively, not with false credentials or clever deceptions, simply because nobody thought of stopping him. He moved through the world in a way that made him easy to overlook, and he had, over the course of their 4-year marriage, leveraged this quality into entry to a remarkable number of places that should have been off-limits to him. He was sitting with a small notebook open on his knee. The notebook was the standard kind, small and dark blue, the sort sold in any office supply store, and he went through them at a rate that had always puzzled her, filling them with dense columns of symbols and numbers and branching diagrams she had never bothered to decode. He was writing in it now with a short pencil. He did not look up at Soon Reth. He did not look at the delegates. He did not look at the Varric ships on the screen behind the podium. He was writing numbers. Laura had married Daniel 4 years ago at a small ceremony in her parents' backyard in Ohio. Her editor at the time had attended and said afterward, with genuine and visible kindness, that Daniel seemed like a gentle soul. Her mother had said, very quietly on the drive home, that he had an interesting face. Her friend Carla had said that he seemed like the kind of man who would be useful in an emergency, though she had been unable to specify what kind of emergency she had in mind. Laura had thought about all of these assessments in the years since. She had decided they were all correct and all incomplete, which was generally true of anything anyone said about Daniel. He worked in what he called systems theory. When pressed for elaboration, he said it involved modeling the behavior of complex networks under stress conditions. When pressed further, he talked for a while about information flow and probability distributions, and what he called emergent collapse patterns. And most people stopped pressing after a few minutes. Laura had stopped pressing after about a year. He had no rank. He had no uniform. He had no institutional affiliation that she had ever seen listed anywhere with a job title attached to it. He consulted apparently for a range of organizations, though the consulting produced no visible income she could identify, which was fine because her salary covered them both, and she had never needed to ask questions about money. He had never, to her knowledge, been in a fight. He had never raised his voice. He had never been the loudest person in any room she had taken him to. He had the kind of physical presence that photographs could not quite capture, because there was nothing about him that insisted on being noticed. She had married him because he was the most honest person she had ever met, and because he laughed at the same things she laughed at, and because on their third date he had taken her to a rooftop in the city at 2 in the morning and shown her his notebook and tried, for the first time, to explain what he was working on. She had not understood most of it, but she had understood that he was trying, and she had understood that the work meant something to him in a way that went down very deep, past ambition and past career, into something she did not have a word for. She had thought about that rooftop often. She had not thought about it recently. She was thinking about it now. Watching him write in his notebook while Soon Reth waited for the United Nations to formulate a response to the end of human sovereignty over half its inhabited space. She leaned across 2 empty seats. "Daniel," she said quietly. He looked up. He had that expression he always had in the middle of work, calm and fully present, and also slightly elsewhere, as if one layer of him was here in the room and another layer was still inside the numbers. "You should not be in here," she said. "I know," he said. "How did you get in here?" "Someone opened the door." She stared at him. "How did you know about the Shen?" He looked at her. In that way he had steady and clear. "Admiral Voss called me." Laura had been a journalist for 14 years. She had a practiced professional relationship with surprise, which meant she should learn to receive it without it showing on her face. She did not entirely succeed this time. Admiral Nora Voss commanded the Joint Interstellar Command. She had 2 stars on her collar and a service record that included the first deep space engagement with non-human vessels 11 years ago, when nobody had known those vessels were coming. She was not a person who called civilians. "Why did she call you?" Laura asked. Daniel was already looking back at the notebook. She wanted a second opinion. "On what? I can't say right now." He turned a page. He went back to writing. The session resumed around them, and for the next 4 hours Laura sat in the press gallery doing her job, interviewing people in brief whispered exchanges during recesses, filing real-time dispatches to her network, doing all the things she was trained to do. And the whole time, 3 seats away, Daniel wrote in his notebook and did not look at the Varrock, and she found, increasingly, that she could not stop looking at him. The session ended at 6 in the evening. The delegates moved toward the exits in tight groups. Security had tripled since the morning. The Varrock did not move from where they stood. They had nowhere they needed to be. They could wait. Laura caught Daniel before he reached the corridor door. "We should go home," she said, together. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, something careful and something honest. "I can't tonight," he said. "I have to go to the command complex. I'll call you." 2 security officers materialized on either side of him before he had finished the sentence. She had not seen them approach. She had not seen them anywhere near him during the session. They were the largest men she had seen all day. She stood at the corridor entrance and watched the 3 of them move away. Daniel in the middle with his notebook under his arm, unhurried. A thin man in a gray jacket being escorted by people who looked like they had been built to a different specification than most humans. She stood there for a long moment. Then she went back to work. The next 2 days moved the way crisis always moves, too fast in some hours and stopped dead in others. The Varrock remained in the UN complex. They did not eat, or if they did it was not during any observable period. They did not sleep. They stood or sat in the conference areas with a stillness that was not patience exactly, but something colder, the absence of any need to be anywhere else, which is different from peace. Laura filed 6 stories in 40 hours. She interviewed government ministers, military analysts, a pair of colonial administrators whose families were still on Proxima, a psychologist who had been brought in to brief the diplomatic staff on managing sustained threat exposure, and a child. The child was 12 years old. Her name was Marisol, and she had been evacuated from New Carthage with her mother and younger brother 2 weeks earlier. She sat across from Laura in a refugee processing center outside Geneva, and described watching the Varrock come through the colony's main airlock with the precise factual tone of someone who had decided that if they kept the facts in front of them like objects on a table, the facts would not be able to get inside them. Laura filed the child's interview first. It ran for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Her editor called immediately and said it was the piece of the crisis. She said thank you and hung up and sat alone in the rental car for a few minutes before she was ready to work again. On the morning of the third day, 41 hours into the Varek's 72-hour window, her source inside the command structure sent her a message. Pete Garza was a logistics officer, mid-level, with a talent for being unremarkable that rivaled Daniel's. He had been her source for 3 years. He sent useful things cautiously, and never anything that crossed a line, and the message he sent at 0340 hours was not his usual careful paragraph. It was 3 words. Something is happening. She called him. I can't give you details, he said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not fear. Something rawer than fear and also stranger. What is it, she asked. Voss pulled 4 of her best tactical officers off the crisis response rotation last night, he said. She replaced them with civilians. I pulled the access logs because I thought it was an error. It wasn't. One of the replacements is a woman who studies collective migration patterns in birds, real birds, Earth birds. She has no security clearance above level 2. And the others? Laura asked. A materials physicist, a game theory professor from Stanford, and a man named Daniel Holt. She did not say anything. You're Daniel Holt, Pete said. I checked. Thin guy, gray jacket, no listed institutional affiliation. He walked into the Joint Command Operations Center at 0200 hours, and Voss met him at the door personally. What are they doing? I don't know, Pete said. The room is sealed, but whatever it is, Voss is letting him run it. The line was quiet for a moment. Laura could hear Pete breathing. You're not going to ask me what the bird woman has to do with any of this, he said. Not yet, she said. She hung up. She looked at the ceiling of the rental car. She thought about Daniel on their 3rd date, on a rooftop at 2 in the morning, with the notebook open to a page that looked like a map of something that had never been mapped before. She thought about the way he had looked at the page and then at her and said quietly, I think I know what the shape of it is. I don't know yet what to do with the shape. She had thought he was talking about the work. She thought now that he might have been talking about more than one thing at once. She opened her recorder. She started building the story she could not yet file. At hour 63, 9 hours before the deadline, Admiral Voss requested an unscheduled briefing with the Varek delegation. This should not have been possible. The Varek had structured the entire encounter as a one-way announcement. They had issued a demand. They were waiting for compliance. They did not negotiate, had not negotiated, had given no indication that negotiation was a category they recognized. A request for a meeting from the species being compressed was, in their framework, like a house asking to discuss the terms of its demolition. They agreed to the briefing. Laura found out 12 minutes after the session was called, from a junior aide who had been excluded from the sealed room and was standing in the corridor looking like someone who had just seen a card trick and could not find where the card had gone. She was outside the briefing room in 20 minutes. 11 other journalists arrived over the next 40. They distributed themselves along the corridor wall, all of them doing the same thing Laura was doing, recording ambient sound, calling sources, annotating notes, and listening to a closed door. The session ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes. When the doors opened, the corridor noise stopped entirely. Soon Reth came out first. Laura had spent 72 hours studying the Varek. She had pulled every piece of Varek contact footage available, had spoken with 3 xenobiologists overnight, had read the preliminary contact behavior analysis issued by the command's research division. She had built a working vocabulary of Varek physical communication. She did not have a word for what she saw on Soonreth's face as it came through the door. It was not the assessment expression. It was not the cold patience she had watched for 3 days. The shoulder plates were held at an angle she had not seen before. The lower jaw was slightly open. The 3rd row of eyes, which typically remained still, were moving. Behind Soonreth came 3 more Varek, then the human diplomatic team, then Admiral Voss, who moved with the same compressed efficiency she always moved with, absorbing the presence of the corridor crowd without any visible acknowledgement. And behind Voss, in the gray jacket, with the notebook tucked under his left arm, came Daniel. He found her in the crowd before she found him. He crossed the corridor directly, not hurrying, not performing calm, simply moving toward her, because that was the direction he had chosen. Is there somewhere we can go? He said. They found a room 2 floors down, a briefing room not in use, chairs folded against the wall and a whiteboard covered in diagrams from some previous meeting. Laura sat on the edge of a table. Daniel sat across from her, and he set the notebook down, and he put both hands flat on his knees and looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Some of it I can't say yet, but I can tell you the shape of it." She recognized the phrase. She felt it land somewhere precise. "Tell me," she said. "The Varric use a predictive expansion strategy," Daniel said. "It is a mathematical framework. Complex but identifiable once you know what you are looking at. The entire model is built on a set of base assumptions about how intelligent civilizations behave under existential pressure. The model is very good. It is better than anything we have built. It accounts for military escalation, resource calculation, cooperative behavior, collective resistance, and staged surrender. It predicts outcomes in those categories with a high accuracy rate, based on what they have encountered before." He paused. His voice was steady and unhurried, the same tone he used when he explained anything, buying groceries or the nature of the universe. "I have been working on a related class of models for about 9 years," he said. "Not for military applications. I was modeling information propagation through complex systems, how networks behave when they are under stress, how collapse and reformation work. The underlying architecture is similar to what the Varric are using. Different application but the same mathematical family." "You recognized it," Laura said. "I recognized it the first time I saw their tactical behavior reports, 3 months ago, when they took the first outpost. I sent a paper to Admiral Voss's office that nobody read for 6 weeks. He did not say this with bitterness. It was a fact. After New Carthage they read it. And she called you. She asked me to look at the full behavioral data set and tell her what I saw." "What did you see?" "A model with a gap in it," Daniel said. "A fundamental assumption buried in the base layer. The Varric model assumes that any sufficiently intelligent civilization, when facing total loss, will select the behavioral option that minimizes immediate harm to its population. It weights heavily for self-preservation at the collective level. It weights heavily for rational cost-benefit analysis under pressure." He stopped. He looked down at the notebook for a moment. "Humans do not always do that," he said. "About 30% of human military and survival decisions in our historical record, when you map them against the Varric framework, return null values. The model produces no output. It has no category for those decisions because it has no reference point for the underlying mechanism. The Varric have never encountered a species that will voluntarily accept catastrophic short-term harm for long-term outcomes that cannot be precisely calculated. They have no framework for a civilization that does things because they mean something rather than because they calculate favorably." He looked up at her. "We do things like that constantly," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You showed them the null values." "I showed Sunreth a list of 37 human decisions that the Varric model predicted were statistically impossible and that we made anyway. Stalingrad, where we chose to hold a city at a cost that destroyed our own ability to hold it and then held it anyway. The Apollo program, which had no calculable economic return at the time, and which we built entirely on a statement about what it meant to be human. Commander Osi last year at Kepler, who held with 6 ships against 41 for 19 hours, and won not by conventional calculation, but by making moves that the Varric tactical analysis classified as irrational. Irrational is the word they use when the model returns null. What did Sunreth say?" "It was quiet for about 4 minutes," Daniel said. "Then it asked me if I could mathematically verify the null values. I showed it my methodology. It asked if the null values were errors in the model or errors in the historical data. I told it that was the right question, and that the answer was that they were errors in the model. Then it asked me what the underlying mechanism was." "What did you tell it?" Daniel looked at her with that expression, the clear and careful one. "I told it that the underlying mechanism was not fully mathematically captured yet, but that the available evidence suggested it was related to what happens when a human being assigns subjective value to something they are not willing to lose. The calculation changes entirely when the variable is not a resource or a probability but a meaning." The room was quiet. Outside, through the walls, she could hear the corridor noise had changed. It was louder now, voices rising not in panic, but in something that sounded almost like release. "You told them we are unpredictable," she said. "I told them their model is wrong," Daniel said. "I told them that any strategy built on a model with a 30% null rate will eventually produce a catastrophic error. And I told them I could help them fix it. Help them. In exchange for the colonial territories, the research station, the extraction platform, and a non-expansion agreement pending a joint review process." He paused. They agreed. Laura sat with that for a moment. Then she said, Daniel, yes, you negotiated a treaty. Admiral Voss negotiated the treaty. I provided the mathematical argument that created the conditions for negotiation to be possible. With systems theory, with 9 years of work on complex network behavior, and the particular insight that the Varric model had a hole in it the size of 37 impossible human decisions. He looked at her. The bird migration researcher helped with the null value verification methodology. Her work on how starling murmurations produce emergent behavior that no individual bird calculates was directly applicable. Laura looked at her husband, the thin man in the gray jacket who filled notebooks with numbers no one had asked him about. She thought about null values. She thought about the moves that a model classifies as impossible and then watches a species make anyway. 9 years, she said. Yes, you have been working on this for 9 years. On the underlying models, yes. And I never asked you what the notebooks were for. He looked at her. You never asked, he said. That is true. There was no accusation in it. It sat between them like a fact on a table, clean and without injury. She did not have an answer for it. She reached across the distance between them and took his hand. He was still for a moment. Then he turned his hand over and held hers. Tell me about the models, she said. All of it. Start from the beginning. He picked up the notebook with his free hand. He opened it to the first page. He started from the beginning. The treaty was signed at hour 71, 59 minutes before the deadline, in a conference room on the 4th floor of the UN complex. Representatives of the United Earth Assembly and Commander of Expansion Soon Reth of the Varric signed a 3-page document that was simultaneously the simplest piece of international law Laura had ever read and the most significant thing in human history since the first time a human being looked up at a star and decided to go there. The key terms were full return of New Carthage colony and its population, return of the Proxima research station and all personnel, return of the Kepler extraction platform and associated infrastructure. In exchange, access to human mathematical research in the area of complex network modeling, and establishment of a joint review body to examine and revise the Varric predictive expansion framework. The review body would operate for a minimum of 3 years. All expansion activity would be suspended for the duration of the review. That was the whole document. Laura filed her story from the corridor at 11:12 p.m. She stood against the wall with her recorder and spoke in a low, controlled voice, while around her the other journalists were doing the same thing. And the corridor had that particular quality she associated with history, the electric stillness of people who know they are inside something that will be described for a very long time. Her story covered the timeline with precision. She gave the terms of the treaty, the sequence of events leading to the emergency session, Admiral Voss's formal statement, and the Varric's acknowledgement that the expansion campaign was suspended. She gave the timeline of the colonial recoveries beginning within 24 hours. She described the reaction of the Proxima families, who were being told right now, in the refugee processing center, that they were going home. She did not mention Daniel by name. He had asked her not to. She had told him that was not a conversation she could have as a journalist, and also as his wife at the same time. And he had nodded and said he understood, and then he had said, "Not yet then. Can we say not yet?" She had said yes. Her editor called 4 minutes after she filed. His message said, "This is extraordinary." Then on a separate line, "Who is your husband?" She replied, "I am still working on that story." The formal celebration at the command complex was loud and long and genuine, and Laura stayed for 1 drink and 2 conversations, and then found Daniel in the parking structure below the building, sitting on the hood of their car with his notebook open on his knee, in the fluorescent light of the empty concrete space, writing. She sat beside him. "Already working," she said. "Soon Reth gave me access to the original model architecture before the signing," he said. He was looking at the notebook, but she could tell part of him was also looking at something farther away. "There are elements in the base construction I have not seen before. I want to capture my first impressions before the clarity fades. Can I read it?" The notebook. He handed it to her without hesitation. She had held his notebooks before. She had never opened one. She did so now, turning to the first page, and found dense columns of notation she could not read, branching diagrams and symbol sequences that mapped a private language she had never learned. She turned through the early pages, and the work was dense and continuous and deeply beyond her. But as she moved toward the middle of the notebook, something shifted. The columns gave way to what looked like maps. Not geographic maps, but structural ones, networks of lines and nodes with values assigned to the connections, and beside each node, small annotations in the cramped shorthand she had seen on the edges of his pages for 4 years. She could not read the notation, but the shapes were comprehensible, the way the shape of a river is comprehensible, even if you cannot name every tributary. She turned to a page near the back. The date at the top was 3 weeks ago. Below it was a diagram she could not parse, but at the very bottom of the page, written in a slightly different pen, was a single line. She read it. She read it again. Daniels. Yes, she looked up. This line at the bottom, 3 weeks ago, he leaned over. The line said, "The only variable in any complex system that I have not been able to model is what happens when a human being encounters something they are not willing to lose." He was quiet. Was that about the Varric, she asked? Or something else? He looked at the line for a moment. He had that expression that meant was choosing his words the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground, carefully and with full attention. "I was thinking about Commander Osi," he said, "and about myself, and about several things that were the same thing described differently." The parking structure hummed around them. Above the open upper level, the sky was dark but not fully dark, the first pale suggestion of morning, beginning to build far to the east where the city ended and the land opened up. She closed the notebook. She held it against her chest for a moment. She thought about the 37 decisions. She thought about the null values, the moves that the model said were impossible, and that a species made anyway, because the calculation had stopped being about probability and become about something that did not fit in the model. She thought about a woman who had married a quiet man and spent 4 years being faintly, privately embarrassed by him in rooms full of people who did not notice him. She thought about what she had missed and how early she had missed it. She handed the notebook back. "Teach me the models," she said. "All of them. Do not simplify. I want to understand the actual work." "That is going to take a long time," he said. "We have a non-expansion treaty and 3 years of joint review," she said. "We have time." He looked at her. The small smile came, the one she had first seen at their wedding, when she had said the part about seeing each other clearly. She had thought it was happiness. She understood it now more precisely. It was the expression of a person who has been waiting for a question they were not sure would come. He opened the notebook. He turned to the first page. The parking structure hummed. The city outside was loud with relief, the particular joyful noise of a world that had just learned it had more time. And in the fluorescent quiet of that concrete space, a woman began learning the language her husband had been speaking in notebooks for 9 years. Starting at the beginning, at the shape of things, at the places where all the models started before they became what they were. The Varric research team arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 4 months after the signing. It was overcast and the air had the blunt, practical chill of a season changing its mind, and Laura stood on the tarmac at the Joint Command Reception Facility, with her recorder running and her collar up, and watched the Varric transport ship descend through the cloud base like a dark geometric thought. It was a different kind of arrival than the first one. The first time, 3 weeks before the crisis, when the initial Varric vessel had taken a position in high orbit and opened a communication channel, the entire planet had gone rigid. Laura remembered watching the first broadcast of the contact footage and feeling the air in the newsroom become very dense, as if the collective breath of everyone in the building had thickened. That arrival had felt like a hand reaching down from somewhere very large to touch something very small. This arrival was not like that. It was still large. The ship still made the sky feel lower, but it came down gently, hydraulics absorbing the final meters with a precision that was almost considerate. And the tarmac crew, who had been at their posts since 0400, moved toward it with the professional focus of people who had a job to do. Soon Reth came down the ramp first. It looked different than it had in the UN chamber. Laura had spent 4 months refining her reading of Varric physical communication. She had sat in with 3 sessions of the joint review body as a credentialed observer, had watched hours of interaction footage with Daniel in the evenings and asked him to explain what he saw, and then argued with his interpretations, until she understood why she was wrong. She knew how to read the shoulder plates now. She knew what the different configurations of the lower hands meant. She knew the difference between the first, second, and third level scans, which the Varric used the way humans use facial expressions, roughly and fluently, and without conscious intention. Soon Reth was doing a third-level scan as it came down the ramp, not assessment, not territorial measurement. It was looking for something. It found it. Daniel was standing at the edge of the welcome formation, which was arranged in a loose formal C-circle behind the diplomatic lead. He was in the gray jacket. He had a new notebook, the fourth since the signing, tucked under his left arm. He was not at the front of the group. He was not at the side. He was simply present. Unremarkable in the way he was always unremarkable. In the back third of a group of people, the last person in the lineup that a camera would find. Soon Reth walked down the ramp. It walked across the tarmac. It passed the diplomatic lead, who stepped forward with a prepared greeting and received a brief acknowledgement. It passed the Joint Command officers in their uniforms. It passed the scientific delegation, people and civilians in clothes, who had been briefed extensively on Varric greeting protocol, and who stood in a careful, anticipatory row. It stopped in front of Daniel. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then Soonreth raised its left arm, the upper left, the long, heavy arm. It brought it forward and turned the palm up and opened the hand. The fingers, 4 of them and jointed differently than human fingers, spread outward. The gesture was deliberate and held. Open palm left. Laura had asked Daniel about Varric greeting gestures during one of their evening sessions 2 months earlier. He had explained the system carefully. Open palm right was the standard contact greeting, used between parties of established but unequal standing, the gesture of a senior acknowledging a junior in a way that signaled transaction. Open palm left was different. It was reserved for encounters between parties engaged in intellectual work that each needed the other to complete. Not allies, not equals in the political sense. Intellectual dependence. The recognition that the work required both minds and could not be finished by one alone. The Varric had never used it with any human being in any recorded contact. Daniel looked at the open hand. He looked up at Soonreth's face. He held that for a moment, the looking, not performing anything, just the honest assessment of a person making sure they understood what was being offered before they accepted it. He raised his own hand, open palm. He was not Varric and could not precisely mirror the gesture, but he held it in the same general configuration, the intention clear. They stayed like that for 3 seconds. Then both hands lowered. Soonreth's shoulder plates shifted to the configuration Laura now knew as readiness for collaboration, the way human shoulders come forward over a table when the real work begins. Daniel turned slightly, and the notebook came out from under his arm. They walked together toward the facility entrance. Pete Garza found Laura at the edge of the press area. He had been standing where the tarmac crew had been, and was wearing the expression of someone who has watched something they cannot fully explain, and is deciding whether to be amazed or unsettled. "Can I ask a question?" he said. "Yes," she said. "When did everyone know?" She thought about the question. It was not a simple one. Everyone did not know, she said. That was the whole problem. But some people knew. Voss knew, or she knew enough. She knew what she had when she needed it. "When did you know?" Laura watched Daniel and Soonreth move through the facility entrance. An aide held the door. Neither of them paused. They were already talking. Or Soonreth's translator was already clicking, the notebook already open, and the conversation that had started 4 months ago in a sealed room in Geneva was resuming in the way long work resumes, with full memory and no need to re-establish anything. "I knew something was there for 4 years," she said. "I just did not ask the right question to find out what it was." Pete was quiet. "How do you ask the right question?" he said. "You stop assuming you already know the answer, and then you ask." The welcome ceremony ran for 40 minutes. There were speeches from the diplomatic lead and from the head of the joint review body, a physicist named Carol Reyes, who had the same quality of compressed efficiency as Admiral Voss, and who had been the one to formally certify Daniel's null-value methodology as mathematically sound. There were photographs. There were the procedural exchanges that international protocol required, and they all happened with the practiced smoothness of a world that had decided to take this seriously. Daniel was not in any of the photographs, which was by arrangement. He and Soonreth had moved to a corner of the reception hall and were working. That was the only word for it. The notebook was open on a table between them, and Soonreth had produced its own recording device. A flat oval set beside the notebook. And they were talking in the focused, abbreviated way of people who have already established the vocabulary for a conversation and are now moving through it quickly. 2 Varric researchers had joined them. A human mathematician from the joint review team had pulled a chair over without being asked. The bird migration researcher, whose name was Donna Chu, was standing at the edge of the group making notes on a tablet. Laura watched them for a long moment. She had a press credential, and a recorder, and a story that was still developing, and had been developing for 4 months, and would continue developing for years. She was aware that she was watching the most important conversation currently happening on the planet. Even though it looked like a few people standing around a table in a reception hall while caterers moved trays of food around them. She filed a brief dispatch, factual and clean, covering the arrival, the attendance, the formal exchange, and one quote from Carol Reyes about the scope of the joint review. She did not mention Daniel by name, that arrangement held, but she opened a second file on her recorder and spoke into it quietly. For 3 minutes, the beginning of the deep piece, the one her editor kept asking for. She spoke about what it looks like when a person has been doing something important for a long time, in a way that nobody noticed. About the patience that requires. About the kind of patience that is not resignation, but is instead the long, steady application of attention to work that you have decided matters, regardless of whether anyone around you has understood yet why it matters. She stopped the recording. Across the room, Daniel looked up from the notebook. He found her the way he always found her, directly, without searching. He looked at her for a moment. She held up her recorder. He understood. He nodded once. She pressed record again. She had a lot of questions. She had been building the list for 4 months, and the list had gotten longer every week, because every answer Daniel gave her produced 3 more questions, which was, she had come to understand, the nature of the work. The work did not close. It opened. Every model you built showed you a more precise version of the gap between what you knew and what you were still learning. She thought about Marisol, the 12-year-old from New Carthage, who had gone home last month. She thought about Pete Garza standing on a tarmac, trying to figure out when everyone had missed the thing they should have seen. She thought about Commander Osi holding position with 6 ships, because the calculation had stopped being about ships. She thought about a rooftop at 2 in the morning, and a notebook opened to a page that looked like a map of something unmapped. She thought about the line at the bottom of the page, the only variable I have not been able to model. She crossed the reception hall. She sat down, at the table where her husband was working. Sunrath's third set of eyes tracked her arrival. Its shoulder plates held the configuration she now recognized as collaborative readiness. Daniel looked at her. He did not ask why she had sat down. He pushed the notebook slightly toward her so she could see the current page, a new diagram, the Varric model architecture notated in 2 languages simultaneously, each one glossing the other in the margins. "Show me where it starts," she said. He put his finger on the upper left corner of the diagram, the origin point of the model, the base assumption from which everything else followed. She leaned in to see. Outside, the overcast sky was breaking. Through the facility windows, a line of light came through and crossed the floor and moved steadily across the room. The work continued. The questions were still opening. There was still a great deal that neither species fully understood about the other, and about the particular mechanism that had made 37 impossible decisions possible, and about what it meant when a variable refused to be modeled. But they were working on it. That was what mattered. That was where it started, and where it continued, and where it would go on going as long as the work needed to be done, which was, by Daniel's best current estimate, for a very long time. Laura looked at the diagram. She looked at the origin point under his finger. She started asking questions.